Stupidity isn't a lack of intelligence. We were taught the opposite. Bad judgment comes from not knowing enough, we were told. So the cure is more information. But you've met the person I'm about to describe. Someone better educated than you, better at their job than you, careful and competent everywhere you've seen them. And then, in one particular room, they repeat something they picked up somewhere with total confidence, and it isn't true. When you ask where it came from, they tell you everybody knows. What's strange isn't the moment itself, it's what comes right after. The same question that started out pointing at them turns around and points at you. Which room am I like that in? If a face just came to mind, or if you paused because the face might be your own, stay with me through this one. Here's the reversal before anything else. Stupidity isn't a fault inside a person's head. It's something that happens in the room they're standing in. So today I want to swap out one definition and hand you the smallest possible way out of that room. It starts with a man who wrote this down more than 80 years ago and meant it for people standing exactly where you are. His name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German pastor and theologian. The essay he wrote on stupidity, Dummheit, in the original German, opens like this. As an enemy of the good, stupidity is more dangerous than malice. That's my own translation from the German, and it sounds excessive the first time you hear it. Then he explains, and it's difficult to argue with. You can protest against evil, you can expose it, and if it comes to that, you can stop it by force. Even the person doing it knows, somewhere, what they're doing. Stupidity offers you none of that. Show them the facts, and they just don't have to believe them. Show them facts they can't deny, and they'll wave those off as odd exceptions. There's nothing to push against. And if you press anyway, Bonhoeffer noticed, something else happens. The person doesn't stop and think. They get irritated, and then they go on the attack. You've probably felt that turn in a conversation and assumed you'd handled it badly. You may not have handled it badly at all. Let me tell you when he wrote that. It was Christmas, 1942. Germany had been in Hitler's hands for 10 years, almost to the month. Bonhoeffer, a pastor, was by then inside the circle of people conspiring against the regime, close enough to the plots that arrest was only a matter of time. That winter, he sat down and wrote a long reckoning with the decade, and he gave it to a few of the men he was conspiring with as a Christmas gift. One copy he hid under the roof of his parents' house, so that if he disappeared, the pages wouldn't. He was arrested 4 months later and executed in a camp 3 weeks before the war in Europe ended. The essay survived in the copy under the roof, which is the only reason we have it. The question he was holding was this. His country thought of itself as one of the best educated on earth. So how does a whole country like that end up where his did? There's an obvious answer, and it's the one most of us reach for. There were a lot of bad people. Bonhoeffer had watched for 10 years, and he threw that answer out. What he had actually seen wasn't a headcount of villains. It was ordinary, hard-working, mostly decent neighbours setting their own judgment down somewhere along the way and not picking it back up. Nobody announced they were doing it. Nobody would have described it that way. It simply became easier, week by week, to let the room decide. So he writes, "It is essentially not an intellectual defect, but a human one." And then he adds a line that's worth sitting with. There are people of remarkably quick intellect who are stupid, and people who are intellectually very slow and anything but stupid. Which leaves the question of where stupidity actually comes from. And this is where his answer turns all the way around. Stupidity, he writes, looks less like a psychological problem than a sociological one. Not an illness inside a person, but a condition running between people. That was his claim. Every time some force rises in public, political, religious, it doesn't matter which, a large share of the people under it are struck stupid, which also means it isn't permanent, and it isn't a verdict on anyone's character. On his account, move the person out from under that force, and the same person thinks clearly again. And then, the sentence I've never been able to shake. The power of the one requires the stupidity of the other. Bonhoeffer didn't prove any of this in a laboratory. He was watching a country come apart and writing down what he saw. But about a decade after the war ended, an American social psychologist named Solomon Asch built a very simple experiment that presses on nearly the same spot. People were brought in and told this was a vision test. 2 cards. On one, a single reference line. On the other, 3 lines of different lengths, and one of them matches. You just say, which? It's not subtle. Alone in a room, almost nobody gets it wrong. But you're not alone in the room. Everyone else there is in on it. You're the only real participant, though you don't know that. And you've been seated so that you answer near the end. On certain rounds, one by one, every person before you says the same, obviously wrong answer out loud. Here are the numbers people usually quote from that work. On those rounds, people went along with the wrong answer about 37% of the time, and about 3 out of 4 participants did it at least once, while looking straight at the lines. Then comes the part that matters most. Asch changed one thing. He had a single person in the room, one, give the correct answer. Psychologists call that going along with the majority conformity. It collapsed to somewhere around 5%. What made the majority powerful wasn't its size. It was that nobody in the room was saying anything else. When researchers later pooled these experiments across 17 countries, how much people conformed turned out to vary by country and to shift over time. I'd read that carefully. It's a picture you only get by treating whole nations as single units. But the useful part is simple enough. Conformity isn't a fixed trait people are born with. It moves with the era and the situation, which is quietly the same claim Bonhoeffer made when he called this a sociological problem. He watched it happen to a country. Asch found a small, clean version of it he could run in a room with a few cards. 2 things I want to be clear about. First, this isn't a label to hang on other people. I know what happens when you hear an idea like this. The first face that comes to mind is always somebody else's. But look again at who Bonhoeffer handed this essay to. Men who could be killed for what they were doing. He wasn't giving them away to sort the population. He was warning the people closest to him that they could be pulled in too. And he wasn't alone in seeing it that way. Carlo Cipolla, an Italian economic historian who wrote his own small book about stupidity, landed somewhere close. The odds that a given person is being stupid have nothing to do with their credentials or their position. Nobody gets to stand outside this, and the moment you think you do is probably the moment to check. Second, none of this means the majority is usually wrong. Turn Asch's numbers over. 1 in 4 participants never went along, not once, and across the experiment as a whole, people mostly answered what they saw. So the finding isn't only that human beings are easy to sweep up, it's also a measure of how much pressure people can take. None of this is an argument for doubting everything. It's an argument for noticing the moments when you quietly hand your judgment to someone else. One thing to take with you. It starts with catching one belief you never actually checked. That habit of not checking has a name, and the person who named it is worth a minute. Susan Stebbing. In 1933, she became the first woman in Britain appointed to a full professorship in philosophy, and in a book she published just before the war, Thinking to Some Purpose, she called the habit potted thinking. Canned thinking, we'd probably say now. We swallow tightly compressed statements whole, and swallowing them saves us the work of thinking. Canned food is convenient, and it tastes fine. What Stebbing objected to wasn't the can. It was taking the can and never asking what went into it. She asked citizens for one thing, to be able to think to some purpose. So here's what you might try. Sometime today, you could pick one belief you let through because everybody says so. Just one. And then trace it back to where it came from. Who said this first? Where did I actually come across it? Have I ever checked it myself? You're allowed to end up exactly where you started. The point isn't to change your mind. It's to have opened the can and looked inside. Most of them will hold up fine. That's not a wasted exercise. That's what it feels like to actually own a belief instead of storing it. You're taking back one piece of judgment you'd left with somebody else. Think again about that person from the opening. Sharper than you in almost every setting and strange in one particular room. I've stopped asking what's wrong with their thinking. The question I'd rather ask now is which room they're standing in. And then, which room am I standing in? Take one judgment back today, and someday you'll find it a little easier to say something different, in a room where everyone is nodding. In Asch's experiment, what broke the room open wasn't a crowd of dissenters. It was one person. I'll leave you with Bonhoeffer's own line. Stupidity can never be cured by instruction, but only by an act of liberation. Thank you, as always, for coming this far with me.
Everybody said so I nodded along. But who said it first? I never asked. Half my hand was up and then it wasn't. Nothing in the room had told me no. Walked out fine, kept talking to myself. Something in my mouth had gone